Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start things off with a few announcements. First, we will be recording this session and sending it out to you later today. Second, we will be holding a Q&A at the end of the webinar. At any time during the presentation, feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit questions. We will hold them until the end and ask them in the order in which they were received. Finally, in an effort to support our local restaurants, we are holding a raffle today after the webinar for two $50 DoorDash gift cards. So how it works is every webinar you attended within the series entered your name into the raffle. So we'll have that drawing later today and reach out to the winners. With that, I'll hand things over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Petra. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Blancara. I'm Vice President of the Columbus Collaboratory. And on behalf of the Collaboratory and our partner, Vernovus, I'd like to welcome you to the third session of a three-part cybersecurity series. Our goal in putting on these sessions is to provide actionable insights to better secure your enterprise. In previous sessions, we've covered the threat landscape, business continuity planning, as well as vulnerability management. In today's session, we will cover identity access. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about the Collaboratory, Vernovus, and our speakers. Columbus Collaboratory was founded by 7 of Ohio's largest firms to provide trusted cybersecurity and artificial intelligence solutions to reduce costs and increase protection. Our cybersecurity capabilities include threat-centric vulnerability management managed services, security program compliance assessments, offensive exercises, and an active security community of security leaders for threat intelligence and best practice sharing. Vernovus is a full-service staffing and solutions firm specializing in IT, cybersecurity, and accounting and finance. They have a growing business and technology and solutions practice focused on cybersecurity, business continuity, network and cloud architecture, as well as Active Directory and group policy management. From a cybersecurity standpoint, Vernovus's focus is in helping companies build, administer, and maintain strong cybersecurity programs. Let me tell you a little bit about our speakers today. Jeff Schmidt is the Vice President and Chief Cybersecurity Innovator for the Columbus Collaboratory. He has a 25-year information security career, started at Microsoft, where he spearheaded the first internal malicious testing of Windows 2000. In 1998, Jeff worked with the FBI to create the InfraGard program, receiving commendations from the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI. He authored the Microsoft Windows 2000 Security Handbook and contributed several books, including the Cybersecurity Policy Guidebook. Jeff is an adjunct professor of System Security Engineering at the Stevens Institute of Technology, a Zurich Cyber Risk Fellow, Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and is a board member for Delta Risk LLC, a Chertoff Group company, a global advisory firm focused on security and risk management. Jeff received a Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Systems and an MBA from Fisher College of Business at the Ohio State University. Our next speaker is Troy Venon. He's the Director of Security Innovation at the Columbus Collaboratory. Troy has more than 20 years of experience in the information security practice. Troy brings a wealth of experience and leadership to the Collaboratory, which began with an 8-year active duty career with the Marine Network and Security Operations Center in Quantico, where Troy gained hands-on experience in security operations, as well as management and leadership development skills and experience. Following his active duty career, Troy held a number of progressive, more senior IT security positions that include leading security and penetration testing teams, malware research, project management, and director of a global threat center. Since joining the Collaboratory to lead the Collaboratory's information sharing and analysis organization, Troy has provided tactical and strategic direction to our customers. His security software manufacturing experience continues to help inform insight and product direction for the benefit of our customers. Our last speaker is Kevin Jackson. He's a CISO of Vernovus. He's an executive information technologist, enterprise architect, and chief information security officer with 25 years experience, serving in both commercial and DoD environments. An electrical engineer by degree, Kevin's areas of expertise include cybersecurity program management, DoD IT systems architecture and compliance management, pharmaceutical industry IT compliance management, wireless telecommunications, and IT infrastructure management. During his time supporting the U.S. Air Force at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, he served as chief architect and DoD compliance manager for individual IT program investments valued from $50 to $300 million. Most recently, he served as Executive Director of Cybersecurity and Network Infrastructure for a mid-sized family-owned pharmaceutical company with enterprise business side compliance requirements. Kevin is a part-time adjunct professor within the University of Cincinnati's IT department and the Villanova University College of Professional Studies, teaching online classes in cybersecurity and business intelligence data analytics. He has an MBA in IT management and is pursuing a PhD in information technology. With that, I think let's turn it over to Jeff and gain some of his knowledge.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks for setting this up. I will be talking about identity and access management. The importance of identity and access management systems overall cannot be understated. I have a list of a couple of things that you've probably heard me say in the past. You know, if you do one thing well, it should be vulnerability management. If you do two things well, it should be vulnerability management and identity and access management. I think Troy covered vulnerability management last week, and I'll be covering IAM this week. So I'm a believer in this concept of an offense-informed defense or a threat-informed defense. The reason I have so much interest in identity and access management systems is because that's what the bad guys use against us. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about passwords. Security people like minimum privilege or least privilege, but the actual environment in most IT computing systems actually tends to go to maximum privilege. We'll talk about that, multi-factor, and then some practical advice in general, and then with a month of remote work in the COVID universe, some specific observations there as well. Okay, so this is where things fit in. We got that. Let's talk about why IAM is so important. If you talk to any offensive tester, they'll tell you that attackers live off of credentials. Usernames and passwords are the most important part of any attacker's repertoire. And there's a couple of reasons that's really important. All of the kind of the breach tactics that you see, whether it's ransomware or a data exfiltration, either for commercial purposes or for corporate espionage or other state-sponsored business email compromise or BEC. That's a common acronym that we're seeing now that can lead to all sorts of other problems, financial frauds, extortion, all of those things, all those kind of later stage events almost always start with credential compromise. Somebody's credentials got compromised. Those credentials were used to gain access to other systems, to move laterally within a network, and then depending on what the attacker's goals were, what the attacker's business goals were, they then used those credentials to perpetrate one of these crimes or frauds. If an attacker was interested in financial gain, they might do a ransomware sort of situation. If the attacker was a state-sponsored actor that was just interested in wreaking havoc, the exact same access that can be used to perpetrate a ransomware attack could also be used to just mass delete things. And we've seen certain Iranian actors, as Troy mentioned last week, take advantage of those tactics. The reason why there's a bunch of GPUs in the picture here is because the ability to crack passwords and crack hashes has really changed the landscape over the last 5 years or so. So passwords are the way that most authentication is performed nowadays, but passwords are horrible, and they're horrible for lots of reasons. Number one, human beings just aren't good at passwords. They tend to choose things that look like the horrible list of passwords here on the right. And when human beings have lots of different passwords to remember, or when they're subject to change your password every 90 days and make sure that it contains uppercase, lowercase, digits, special, things like that, they tend to fall into really terrible patterns. those patterns are easily predictable. One of the effects of the fact that there are 400, 500 million human passwords in various breach databases over the last 5 or 6 years is that the bad guys have analyzed the heck out of those passwords, and they know how human beings choose passwords. And at scale, that is what enables these spraying and stuffing type of attacks. Spraying and stuffing attacks are, if you're familiar with a brute force attack, which is for the Jeff Schmidt account, try every single possible password, 0000, 0001, 0002, AAA, AAB, AAC, etc. That's a brute force attack. When you do that, your password lockout policy will come into play after 3, 4, 5 bad attempts. The J Schmidt account gets locked out. Jeff then has to call the IT department, reset the password, and it's unlikely that that the attacker got access. A password spray is the inverse of that, where you take a really common password like spring 2020 exclamation mark, try it once, but across the entire user base. So if you have a company of 10,000 people, try spring 2020 once over the entire user base, and you know what? You're gonna get a couple. You just will. And then you wait a half hour, and then you try Go Bucks 2020 exclamation mark. And if you're within a 50-mile radius of Columbus, Ohio, you're gonna get a couple. You just are. And then you wait a half hour, and you try Welcome One, and then you wait a half hour, and you try Let Me In. And given Amazon and cloud computing and all sorts of other technical environments, nowadays, it's trivial for bad guys to spray these requests over a number of IP addresses, source IP addresses. So they're very, very difficult to detect. No password lockout policy will trigger if you try one password every 30 minutes or every hour, and nobody will notice. And these attacks are devastatingly effective. If you have a public-facing single-factor password authentication system, it's probably been sprayed, and there's a good chance it's been compromised with these sorts of passwords. The difference between a spray and a stuffing style attack, password stuffing is trying credentials that are found in one breach database against other systems. So again, human beings, right? We all have 50, 100 different usernames and passwords for everything from work systems to online banking to the system that I used to register for a 5K this weekend. A lot of those are in breach databases, and if you try the 5K breach database usernames and passwords against chase.com, you're gonna get a couple. You just are. If you try the 5K breach database usernames and passwords against a Salesforce account for business, you're gonna get a couple. You just are. So those are what stuffing attacks are. These are all rooted in the fact that passwords, as we have implemented them for the past 25 years, are terrible, terrible, horrible, horrible things. And the password guidance up until December of last year that actually came from NIST and was most popularly memorialized in the PCI requirements. We all know them, and we can probably repeat them ad hoc here. Of the sets, uppercase, lowercase, digit, special, choose 3 of the 4 and change your password every 90 days. What do human beings do when they're presented with that sort of guidance? They choose passwords like season, year, exclamation mark. When they have to change their password in 90 days, they change it to summer 2020 exclamation point. When they have to change their password in October, they change their password to fall 2020 exclamation point. All kinds of horrible patterns like that are well known to attackers. If you're a formally trained security guy or gal, you're familiar with the concept of least privilege. And least privilege is this theoretical panacea where every computer and every person has exactly the amount of privilege or the amount of power to do what they need to do, no more, no less. And it's a wonderful thing that we all read about in textbooks. But like most wonderful things that we read about in textbooks, it's not the way the world works. And in fact, what we find is that most large corporate networks actually tend to a state of maximum privilege over time. What do I mean by that? If you've worked for a company for 10 years and you've moved from role A to role B to role C, you tend to accumulate the privileges required to do those jobs over time. People rarely remove access because removing access tends to break things, and people don't want to break things. And so it's just easier to add access. When something doesn't work, add this, add that. When you can't get a a program to work, what do? Run it as admin. When you can't get, the Linux admins on the phone here will giggle here. When you can't get some program to work in Linux, what's the first thing you do? You shut off SE Linux, and it probably works. People tend to accumulate credential and privilege and power over time, and systems and programs tend to accumulate privilege and power over time. And combine that with the fact that most networks are flat. And when I say flat, I'm talking about the candy analogy that people use for networks, hard and crunchy on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside. Once you're in, you're in. Again, you talk to any offensive tester, they'll tell you that lateral movement, once you're inside a corporate network, is like a blowtorch through butter. It's really, really difficult to prevent lateral movement. So what does that mean? That means that when Mabel in accounting clicks on the phishing link, or when Mabel in accounting, brings in the USB stick that has something bad on it because the neighbor's kid downloaded a game and the home machine is infected. Once the attacker gets the unprivileged account on Mabel in accounting's computer, it's pretty easy for them to escalate on that computer and then move around in the enterprise, and that's what they do. This is largely the result of both Mabel's account and Mabel's computer having more privilege than it needs. For years and years and years, in Windows environments, people used to have local administrator. Why did they have local administrator? Because it makes things easy. If you want to install a printer driver, or you need to, there's dozens of things that you might need to do on a computer on a regular basis that require local administrator privilege. When Mabel in accounting has local administrator privilege, which is unnecessary most of the time, and downloads that, that or clicks on that bad link or plugs in that untrusted USB device, suddenly the attacker owns Mabel's machine locally and is able to move from there pretty easily. Lately, it's gotten easier, particularly in a Windows environment, to remove local administrator privilege machines. That's a really important thing to do if you haven't already done it. Local users that are subject to going to websites and reading email and things like that should not have administrator privilege on their machines. One of the most common IT department provisioning practices is this concept, or this practice I call provisioning by cloning. And what do I mean by that? If you hired a guy named Jeff, and the guy named Jeff is sitting next to the guy that's been there for 5 years named Troy, and the stuff that you hired Jeff to do is kind of similar to the stuff that you hired Troy to do, the IT department is very likely to provision the Jeff account by cloning the Troy account and just calling it Jeff. That practice, again, it's very, very popular. It's sometimes an easy way to make things work quickly. And we all know IT help desks are overworked and underpaid and like to make things work quickly. But it's also a very easy way to stumble into this overprivileged sort of state. Let's say Troy has been at the company for 15 years and has moved through a bunch of roles, and over the years has accumulated 15 years worth of privilege in 5 different departments at the company. And then you just cloned the Troy account to make the Jeff account, and now Jeff has all of that privilege that Troy has accumulated over the years. very common practice, and unfortunately, it leads to a lot of the issues that we have with over provisioning. So I want to pause here and give the rest of the team, I've talked a lot about the very practical IT admin practices that we see that create some of the problems that we're in. Any comments or notes from the field from the practitioners on the call?
Absolutely. I'd love to chime in right there. Thanks, Jeff. There's so much truth baked into what you said over these first few slides, especially when it comes to the implementation, the day-to-day work that is required to manage user accounts and manage people. It reminds me of the analogy that's often used. People describe the overall security of the internet. They often point out very accurately that when the internet was created, it was created to be fast and to support connections and to support data sharing. In its initial architecture, it was not created to be secure. And over the years, security has been added on and bolted on to how the internet works. And it's kind of always played a catch-up role, trying to catch up with the technology, catch up with the bandwidth, because the basic structures of internet connectivity weren't built on a let's be secure foundation. So it's very much the same picture in the enterprise. Enterprise IT is usually designed and built to be fast, to be highly capability driven, to provide the services that users need. And then, unfortunately, in our modern world, we're bolting on security and checks for all these different aspects of access and vulnerability and everything else kind of after the fact, and it's not a good way to go about things. What often is the best practice, though it can be difficult, is to kind of change the whole perspective and re-engineer some of these approaches to have security in their foundations. When it comes to creating new accounts, when it comes to how we manage vulnerabilities, getting these things shifted around so that the foundational processes start off with security in mind, instead of just embracing, well, whatever it takes to be fast and whatever it takes to be functional, and then leave these massive gaps that end up ruining or taking down or badly hurting the company when a cybersecurity breach happens. So I love that you brought this up, and it's really part of what, in my position, what the CISO function is trying to do, is to shift around, make that sea change happen, and how everything is viewed to get security down into the foundation instead of just trying to force it from the top down.
Yeah, I agree with that. And if I could hop in here, so a couple of points. So if as a viewer, you have been involved in this entire series that we've been doing over the last 3 weeks, we started by talking about strategy in your cybersecurity programs. And then the second week, we did a little bit deeper dive in strategy into vulnerability management, right? So if you were around last week, one of the things that I specifically mentioned is this concept of understanding the value of your assets and the access that those assets have in your environment. And this really is exactly what Jeff is talking about. So in that example from last week, we talked about the two separate systems in your environment. If you have two machines in your environment, you need to understand which one needs to be prioritized to be remediated first for a number of reasons. And the example we used was you've got a machine that's responsible for payroll and another machine that's responsible for making coffee. And the question that I always pose is, which one do you prioritize to fix first? And the
coffee.
Right, the coffee machine. The trailing question there, or the truly information that you need to understand about that coffee machine versus the payroll machine is there an attack path that is possible from the coffee machine that doesn't necessarily exist from the payroll machine? And what we were talking about then is exactly what Jeff is talking about now. How many, or what sorts of access and what sorts of permissions are nested inside of that coffee machine by virtue of the domain controller, of domain admin? Do we have user accounts that are nested in groups, that are nested in additional groups, and then ultimately is a potential for an attack path from Mabel's account on that coffee machine into domain admin? So exactly what Jeff is talking about here. So the strategy in your security program and the strategy in your vulnerability management program, and then also in your IAM program is to understand how those permissions and those credentials and those access rights are nested and what sorts of access an attacker can gain by simply elevating permissions from a basic user and then working their way through your environment. It's exactly what Jeff's talking about.
Cool. Thank you. So no discussion of authentication and passwords would be complete without multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is just the addition of some factor beyond a password. So you have to do something. We used to say authentication is performed on something you have, something you know, or something you are. Something you have being a token, something you know being a password or a secret or a key, and something you are being a biometric factor. Multi-factor authentication is just combining 2 or 3 of those together. So something you know, a password, and something you have, a token, a hard token, or the phone applications to actually implement something you have, a factor by that something you have is the phone, provably because of the app there. We've all seen this, the phone application, text message, people that have been doing this for a while are used to the physical tokens, the RSA secure IDs, YubiKeys, things like that. Properly implemented, and I always have to put that caveat in there, properly implemented, multi-factor authentication provides very broad and very strong protection against a wide range of attacker techniques. Dollar for dollar, pound for pound, proper implementation of multi-factor authentication is one of the most valuable security ROI expenditures that you can make, particularly for internet connected systems. Given that bad guys are actively pursuing credentials, given that every day the breach databases get larger and the GPU processing power to calculate hashes becomes greater, using properly multi-factor authentication gets you a lot of security value. And if you don't have a plan, or if you don't have multi-factor authentication implemented, particularly on internet-facing systems, there really can't be anything higher on your list. And all that being said, multi-factor authentication, it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, it's not invincible. There are a number of mechanisms that attackers are using to bypass multi-factor authentication, some more effectively than others, but it separates you from the run-of-the-mill password sprays and credential stuffing attacks that are happening on the internet every day. During the time that I've been doing this talk, all of your internet-facing portals have probably been sprayed a couple of times. It's that common. And implementing multi-factor authentication raises the bar tremendously and really helps separate you from an easier to compromise prey. All that being said, multi-factor authentication creates new problems, as always. In the security space, we solve one problem and create 3 more. One of the most interesting things we're seeing now in a very modern aspect is unprompted password or verification requests to mobile phone applications. So if you have, this is an Office 365 example, but any of you that are using verification request sort of applications for multi-factor authentication like Microsoft Office 365, you've seen this sort of dialogue before. You try to log into an Office 365 account, the app on your phone pops up and says, hey, jschmidt@collaboratory.com, are you trying to log into Office 365 right now? Hit deny or approve. Well, what the bad guys have found is that they can spray or stuff the jschmidt@collaboratory.com account, knowing that that dialog box will appear on Jeff's phone, and Jeff is likely to look at it and say, well, yeah, this is from Microsoft and I use the Collaboratory account, so yeah, approve, because I need that to work. And people are unknowingly approving malicious access to their account. The bad guys just started trying it. Again, it's a numbers game, right? If you spray a large enterprise, 10,000 accounts with spring 2020 exclamation point, you're going to get a couple. You just are. Of that subset, If you try logging in knowing that there's multi-factor authentication to that subset, and the approve deny appears on, 400 people's mobile phones, a couple are gonna click on it, approve, they just are. We have to remember as security folks that the non-security folks, when we display the kind of UI garbage that we so often display, what users see is akin to the graphic on the right here. They don't understand it. They just hit approve, hit OK, do whatever to make it go away. That goes for authentication requests, that goes for certificate errors, that goes for pretty much every security alert that security nerds like me have come up with over the years. It's not user friendly, and people will just tend to go through it. So unfortunately, I find myself providing the kind of advice that we've been providing to people in the spam and email space for years. What did we used to tell people in spam and email? Don't open emails that aren't from people that you don't know, or don't open attachments that you weren't expecting, whatever that means. And we all know how well that went for us. Well, now, unfortunately, we have to tell users, hey, don't click approve when your mobile phone authenticator app pops up and you weren't expecting it. Again, for some weird case of expecting. Or it's a very unfortunate user experience and user interface spot that we're in right now, but the bad guys are exploiting it, and this is happening every single day, particularly in a post-COVID era where more people are working from home than ever before, and a lot of people that are working from home are not used to working from home and may not be as accustomed or as hardened to these sorts of tricks. So practical advice, the NIST 863 update that went out in December of 2019 is probably one of the most important, influential, and practical pieces of NIST advice to come out in the last 10 years. 863B updates the official NIST guidance on password policies. And it specifically addresses these three items. It undoes the periodic password change requirements. It has been thought for a long time that it is some sort of best practice to make people change their passwords on a regular basis. That is very old guidance based on 1950s computing power and the reality of the 1950s. Now, what NIST discusses in 863B is the more often you make humans change their passwords, the more likely they are to write them down, to reuse the same password, or to use some sort of a trivial algorithm to generate multiple passwords. Stick an ordinal on the end. How many of us have done this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the end, right, until it works. Stick exclamation marks on the end. Oh, it didn't like 2? Okay, I'll try 3. Okay, it didn't like 3? All right, I'll try 4. Right? Well, of course the bad guys know all that, and they do that. So 863B says only force users to change passwords if you suspect a breach. If you suspect that your database has been compromised, then then force your users to change the passwords. But if there's no suspicion that the passwords have been compromised, don't unnecessarily force users to change their passwords. The subtext to that is, it is more secure to have a better, longer, more complex, less guessable password that changes infrequently or never than it is to have a crappy, short, easily predictable, probably already in a breach database password that changes every 60 days or 90 days. Really important stuff. By the way, your IT help desks are happier too. 2/3 of all IT help desk tickets are related to password reset issues. 2/3. If you're a company that's gone through and calculated the cost of those things, I've seen numbers from big companies where they calculate the cost is $30 or $40 every time somebody calls into the help desk, and of those, 2/3 are password issues. So just interesting. the silly algorithmic complexity, uppercase, lowercase, digit special, that doesn't help. And in fact, creating those requirements, when you tell the bad guy what the namespace is to search, it actually makes their job easier. And it also creates the really silly patterns that we talked about before. So 863B drops that. And then also 863B says that you should screen passwords against common and compromised lists. The bad guys are doing that. The 400 million passwords that human beings use in all the various breach databases are out there. They're in a whole bunch of lists that bad guys use every day. Why don't we, as the good guys, screen our passwords against those lists? Why don't we intentionally prohibit season year patterns, employer patterns, anything that contains Buckeyes or Bucks or Go Bucks or Ohio State? In niche industries, we see all the time industry terms that are used in passwords that can be screened against. The bad guys know all these things. The problem is that those three pieces of guidance, it's not easy to implement those right now. The tools haven't evolved to that point. Microsoft Active Directory, which in many cases is the system of record for passwords in a lot of enterprises, does not implement 863B guidance as of yet. So if you go into password complexity in Active Directory, there's a little checkbox that says, do you want to do the of the sets uppercase, lowercase, digit special, choose N of M? Oh yeah, sure, that sounds like it's secure. Great, check that box. Do you want to require users to change their passwords every 90 days? Oh yeah, sure, that sounds secure. Check that box. And there's no mechanism to blacklist passwords in Active Directory right now. There's no mechanism to have it block season year combinations and things like that. So if your administrator implemented password complexity in Active Directory today, it is almost certain that spring 2020 exclamation mark will pass that test. And so you have an environment where IT administrators and people looking at policy documents say, oh yeah, we use strong passwords, we've implemented everything we can, and yet you have incredibly crappy passwords. This is important. There's a couple of commercial tools that add that kind of capability to Active Directory, and they're fine. I don't have any opinions on those. There is a tool, I've got a link up here called Cred Defense. It's an open source tool by a pretty well-known offensive firm called Black Hills Security. Because this is so important, the Collaboratory, my team, we audited that code. I had a guy that really knows Windows development. I used to work at Microsoft, so I have some of those, I have that energy to make this piece of open source code really, really high quality, to do all the stuff that oftentimes isn't done in open source, deal with non-Latin characters correctly. A lot of folks don't have Latin characters in their passwords. You go outside of the US, deal with memory management correctly, audit the code. And so we contributed that back, and that's an open source tool that we feel really good about. I understand that me sitting here saying, oh yeah, go download some open source stuff from GitHub and install it on your domain controllers is not might not be the most confidence inspiring path for everybody. I get that. We like to just provide options. It's out there, and it's something to look at. Again, using a commercial tool like that or an open source tool like that buys you a lot of practical security value. Use a password manager. This is for us personally in our personal lives as well as professionally. The best thing you can do is not reuse passwords against multiple systems, and to use long, complex passwords that you don't even know. In browser and in operating system approaches to passwords have gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. Both Safari, and if you use the Apple world, and Edge, if you use the Microsoft world, now have internal capacity to generate passwords and store passwords. And all of my passwords now are these big, 40, 50 character random things that I have no idea what they are. And that's good. And KeePass is the platform that I use. It's open source, it's free. It's just one of several, but it's one that I use. whenever there is an option to use multi-factor, use multi-factor. Again, personally and professionally. Your Yahoo account, your Gmail account, your online banking account, turn on multi-factor. Download the Google Authenticator app, download the Microsoft Authenticator app, use the text messages. People complain that the text message multi-factor isn't secure, and they're right, but it's more secure than nothing. It adds a hurdle. Again, security is not about perfection. Security is about increasing hurdles. And for all the people that complain about the text messaged rolling code, it's a heck of a lot better than nothing. If you're a business, every internet-facing system that you have must be multi-factor. If it's not, you should have a plan to do that. Particularly systems like VPNs. Office 365 nowadays has a fantastic multi-factor option. You need to use it. Bad guys are actively attacking these systems, and they're killing us with it. Make sure that you're using multi-factor on these systems.
Jeff, if I could hop in real quick. So one of the things that's interesting to point out here about, you know, MFA on perimeter and internet facing systems is our offensive teams, regardless of whether our targets or the companies that we're doing some work for tell us that they've got MFA implemented across their perimeter, one of the first things they're going to look for is APIs. Because if there is API that's being authenticated against, the odds that MFA is applied to that API is pretty minimal. So they're going to go and try to find that API for Office 365 that allows some, you know, automated capability to happen, you know, inside or outside of Office 365. They're going to go to that API before they try to go to the front door. So take a strong look at the APIs.
That's a great point, Troy. You know, multi-factor is complicating, and especially if you have a combination of on-prem and cloud systems, I just about guarantee you that your MFA does not work the way you think it does. There's always API endpoints that are single factor. One of the favorites of offensive folks are on-prem Exchange servers. You know, if you have an on-prem Exchange server that you think has multi-factor, and you know your users have to log into a VPN or something like that to get access to it, that might work, except Microsoft Link has a non-multi-factor API endpoint. Address discovery that is used when you auto-configure mobile phones and enroll a new mobile phone in Office 365 has a non-multi-factor API endpoint. This is all the stuff that the attackers know very well about and go after. I would strongly suggest having an offensive exercise for folks that are familiar with multi-factor. Take a look at any, particularly a mixed environment, an on-prem and an off-prem environment, but really any multi-factor environment would benefit from, you know, a really hard look by a strong offensive team. Microsoft with Office 365 they've done a good job on this. If you have a native Office 365 environment, use the Microsoft Office 365 multi-factor, use the application, and you get a lot of really well thought through security value. On the privilege creep or the tendency to maximum privilege, that needs to be actively managed. If you recognize it as a problem, but don't set up a program to on a regular basis review and reduce privilege, then eventually your privilege will tend to infinite. The current approaches to periodic review, particularly associated with public companies, some have a requirement for some financial systems to do quarterly access reviews. Let's be honest, most of those are rubber stamp exercises. No manager, you know, when they get the list once a quarter that says, here are your, you know, 117 direct reports, and of those 117 direct reports, here are the 4,318 access entitlements that those people have. Please verify and respond yes or no to each. People are afraid to break things, and they say, oh yeah, sure, that looks about right. As currently implemented, they're not effective, and we all need harder looks to make these programs more effective.
Hey, Jeff, I want to jump in right there if I can, sir.
Yep.
I want to jump back to the NIST changes in particular, and actually it ties into what you just said right now as well about the need for systemic programs that are going to be strong enough and get nimble enough to actually produce change and catch these sorts of issues and risks. I think all of it points very strongly to just how critical it is to have all of the aspects of a cybersecurity program in place. You can't get by with just one or two. Changes like what NIST has implemented here are extremely dependent on having your enterprise have the other aspects of your cybersecurity program be strong and up and running and functional. What they've in effect done by making those changes and what the requirements are for password management is shifted some of the risk management away from purely being in the password space to putting some of the requirement on what you're doing in terms of incident detection and what you're doing in terms of incident response. Because now that you're not changing passwords, as you mentioned, you need to have very high visibility into when there are breaches, when passwords have been compromised, so that you can then change them. And then when you don't have to go there. So you've moved some of the responsibility, you've shifted some of the risk to another part of the cybersecurity program that hopefully you have up and running. The same is true when it comes to privilege management. If all of these different aspects aren't up and running in coordination with each other in a system, in a programmatized way that actually has defined requirements and that someone is actually working to make sure that the pieces are all shaking hands correctly, then these kinds of changes will do nothing but open up even more vulnerabilities and gaps. It's such a fabric, it's such a mosaic of pieces that have to work together. And if you don't have any one of those key pieces working together and you start making changes in one arena thinking you're making things better, what you really do is open up new vulnerabilities and new risks.
Yep. And if I could build on that a little bit, Kevin. So one of the things that the collaboratory that we, when we talk about, privilege and assessing those privileges, one of the things that we like to talk to our clients and our customers about is in the vulnerability management space, we all fully understand that there's a cadence to scanning. It's something that we do on a regular basis. And then, what we do with that data later is, that's kind of the conversation shift that we're trying to have. In the IAM and in privilege specifically, one of the things that we're trying to get our customers to do is you need to be assessing those privileges on very similar cadences that you are your vulnerability scanning. And what do I mean by that? So there are tools out there like Bloodhound, for example. If you are running vulnerability scans in your environment at the same time or on some similar cadence, you need to be leveraging tools like Bloodhound that is actually interrogating your Active Directory. It's showing you how credentials and how privileges are nested and how they're grouped and how attackers can take advantage of them. That stuff changes over time. You need to be continuously and regularly on a regular cadence assessing those privileges and how those things are built and how they're nested together. So if you're not familiar with Bloodhound, I'd suggest you take a close look at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, right? I mean, as we say in security all the time, security is a weakest link problem. And, the overall program and the overall approach to risk and to how all the pieces fit together is really important. If you just take all of your risk and move it from one place to another, you haven't reduced your risk. You've created another set of problems. A couple of other comments here. We're going into week 6 of COVID work from home. I think there's a couple of points here that I'd like to share. Around credential issues in particular, bad guys are attacking those procedures. A lot of enterprises, for the last 20 years have had, 4, 5, 6% of their staff work from home on a regular basis or work remotely, let's say, on a regular basis. And, suddenly over the course of a week, now they have 90% of their staff working remotely on a regular basis. That's a seismic shift for a company that, has a lot of employees. That has created a lot of first-time remote workers and people calling help desks to get password resets, to get credentials, figure out how to access this system or that system, hastily stood up remote work systems. Some companies that don't have laptops, right? That, people come in and sit at a desk with a traditional desktop machine. some companies have set up VPNs that they can RDP, remote desktop, into those on a hasty basis or on a quick basis, and that's great. That enables the work from home, but the bad guys know that, and they're looking for those systems, and they will target those systems. Your employees and your help desks need training and guidance to avoid traps around attackers leveraging kind of the non-standard emergency mentality of all of this. Somebody calling a help desk in a panic, oh my God, my boss is going to kill me if I don't get access to this system. I need this password reset. I have no idea what my employee ID is. I can't find my ID. It's in, whatever, right? Some sob story. People are helpful. Help desks are helpful. That's why they're called help desks. And those procedures are being attacked. One of the more interesting things that we're seeing quite a bit of, a lot of machines only get their software updates when they're plugged into the corporate LAN. That might be fine when a machine is kind of in and out of the office, or out a couple days a week, in every other week, something like that. But now that we're going into the 6th week of not being connected to corporate networks, updates become an issue, or missing updates become an issue. In particular, all the remote work from home platforms, Zoom in particular, but WebEx, Slack, Teams, everybody else, they've had increased attention on them. There have been some security issues that have been found with those, and they've all issued a number of updates. Zoom had 3 updates in 1 week, a couple weeks ago. If your clients are not receiving software updates, because for whatever reason your configuration doesn't allow it when they're not on the corporate network, that's really important to figure out a way to do that. It is critical that Zoom, Slack, Teams, et cetera, are getting updates in this time, because bad guys are abusing the heck out of those platforms. Microsoft, we've gone through a Patch Tuesday already. You got to get your Microsoft patches distributed to folks that are not on the corporate network too. Finally, it wouldn't be a Jeff talk without some sort of DNS. So something really interesting is going on. Active Directory clients leak a lot of data when they're not on the company network. When you take a Windows machine and you plug it into the internet or at a Starbucks, it looks for its domain controller, it looks for its file shares, it looks for all sorts of things. And when they're not there, but there's still evidence that the machine is looking, and an attacker can use that to learn about the environment. A lot of that stuff isn't directly exploitable anymore, but it gets intelligence on the company and what what naming looks like in the company and such. A lot of folks, when they use a VPN, they do a non-split tunnel VPN, and what that means is all the traffic goes back to the company. That actually buys you a lot of security. Because if your machine is leaking DNS queries and this, that, and the other thing, but you're using a VPN that routes everything back to the company, just like you're on the LAN, you don't leak as much. However, after the first 3 days of everybody on planet Earth doing Zoom, WebEx, and Slack video conferences, split tunnel VPNs became the norm. What I mean by that is all of your traffic does not go back through the company VPN anymore. Only the company traffic goes through the company VPN, and the internet traffic, so your Zoom teleconference, goes directly to the internet. That's great because it frees up lots of bandwidth. These company VPNs designed for 5% of the workforce were never provisioned for 95% of the workforce, but it opens up all the leakage issues that we talked about here. Active Directory naming is really important. There's a link here. I know I'm out of time. Super nerdy, but I want to call attention to one row on here. If your Active Directory is named something that is not in an internet namespace that you control, you have a big problem right now. What I mean by that is if your Active Directory is mycompany.corp or chicago.jeffco or some name that I don't control on the internet, that traffic is leaking out to the internet right now. What this is research done by ICANN that they just released yesterday. And .corp, which is not delegated, it does not exist. There's no way to buy a name in .corp on the internet. But because Microsoft long ago suggested that your Active Directory should be named .corp, in the time between February 3rd and March 17th, so in other words, when remote work turned on, more than double, or the number of queries into the internet route, the DNS route, have more than doubled into .corp. What does that mean? All those machines that used to make queries on the LAN that are now home are making queries that are going to the internet. Look at your Active Directory naming scheme. If your Active Directory naming scheme does not end in, mycompany.com or something that you control, you got a problem, and we need to fix it. That's all I got.
Thank you. Okay, so we will roll right into Q&A. Feel free to continue to submit your questions into the chat or QA feature, and we will answer them offline if we can't get to them live. Our first question, in addition to individuals, can you also comment on customer and supplier assumed access or regular portal use?
Yeah, I mean, portals are internet-facing systems that should be multi-factor. And if I have a business partner, a supplier that I have some ability to influence, due to contract or whatever, I would use every power available to me to require those folks to use multi-factor authentication. And in this day and age, in 2020, I would argue that it is no longer best practice, sufficient security, all the weasel words that we use in our contracts, to not have multi-factor authentication on an internet-facing system. Moreover, a lot of those folks use platforms like Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera, to implement those things under the covers, and Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera, all have mechanisms to implement multi-factor on those. Now, they cost money, and that's going to be unpopular, but it's the right thing to do.
Okay.
Let me piggyback on that and mention that we talked about everything as a fabric. How and as Jeff put it, it's a question of the weakest link. If your vendors are the weakest link, then you can have all the great cybersecurity programming in the world in your enterprise and still fall prey to a weak cybersecurity posture with one of your partners or vendors who has access to your portal or to your network, and lose everything. So it is it's not just an enterprise problem, it is a full partnering and inter-networking and vendor managing problem. Vendor management has never been more important, and it will continue to be. So being able to understand and know and reach out to vendors and partners and work with them to make sure you understand their cybersecurity posture, their implementation of identity and access management and of vulnerability management, and of implementing a full cybersecurity program is absolutely critical, so that they don't become the weak link that puts at risk your whole enterprise.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, we'll squeeze in one more question. Can you elaborate a little more on how you see bad guys using and monetizing credentials that are harvested from these data breaches?
Yeah, that's a good question. So everything starts with credentials, and there's various mechanisms that bad guys use to, look, depending on, your bad guys usually have, one of three objectives. There's criminal actors that are interested in monetizing the data for whatever purpose they serve, be it organized crime or state-sponsored folks that are interested in money, like North Korea. That's kind of category one. Credentials can be sold. There are a number of marketplaces where you can just sell credentials. Credentials are very often leveraged to perpetuate other attacks, ransomware being the most easily monetizable attack right now. Once you get credentials, then you can connect to systems and ransom the data and collect money as a result of that. You can also commit other sorts of extortion. One of the dirty little stepchildren that's happening quite a bit right now is what I call personal level extortion, where you'll gain access to a system, and then gain access to the Jeff email account, and then somebody will reach out to Jeff on the side, and they'll say, "Hey, Jeff, boy, we have access to your email, and yeah, there's stuff in there you probably don't want people to see. There's stuff in there you probably don't want your boss to see, or your significant other. We've all probably gotten the emails right now that claim that, you know, they have video of us watching interesting web traffic or websites, let's say, and, you know, they're going to send this video of us watching interesting websites to all of our contacts unless we pay them money. Unfortunately, that sort of thing works. People pay. People pay because they're embarrassed, because they're scared. The biggest scam after the Ashley Madison and Adult Friend Finder breaches, you know, what are those, 4 or 5 years ago now at this point, were the fake databases. You know, there were more fake Ashley Madison databases than there were real Ashley Madison databases. But people would reach out to say, hey, I see you're in the Ashley Madison database, pay me $5 grand and I'll take you out. And people paid a lot. That's a great way to monetize things. The other actor groups, you know, state-sponsored kind of national security actors, they just want data. They're never really sure why, but they just want it. And so if you're in a space where that's interesting, then, you know, those are potential adversary groups for you. And then there's the general hooligans that, you know, cyber activists or whatever you want to call it, anarchists that just like to, you know, deface things and cause havoc. Depending on which actor group, and some of those folks, by the way, are very well funded. So, you know, anarchists and, you know, cyber activists aren't necessarily just, you know, people sitting in basements. So depending on which actor group is of interest, they have different ways to monetize credentials.
All right, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to end our Q&A there. So Jason, I'll hand things over to you to close us out today.
Yeah, thanks, Petra. And first and foremost, Jeff, really appreciate the informative presentation today. Spot on as always. And Kevin and Troy, thanks for your additional comments around everything that we discussed. Thanks to everybody who is in attendance today. We really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you. Here at Vernovis and at the Columbus Collaboratory, we want to continue to try to share as much information as we can. We understand that this is a rapidly changing and evolving environment that we're in, and we continue to look for ways and for critical pieces of information or presentations that we can get out in this type of format. So I would just invite anybody on the call, if there are things that we haven't discussed yet or you haven't seen that you would like to, we're very open to you queuing up those topics, and feel free to email me directly. My email address is jskidmore, skidmore, @vernovis.com. And I'd be happy to field those and see what else we can do for future sessions just like this. Finally, last note, as Petra mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will be doing our raffle later today for the $50 DoorDash gift cards. So we'll have 2 winners for that, and we'll make those notifications by tomorrow so that you can be aware, and we hope you enjoy lunch on behalf of Vernovis and the Collaboratory. So once again, thank you. Appreciate your time. Stay safe, and we'll look forward to getting back with you all very soon. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.